Hey, how's it going, everybody? Shaun here from Zoobox, and today we're going to be talking about Alex Proyas' 2004 film I, Robot. The movie stars Will Smith, Bridget Moynihan, Bruce Greenwood, Alan Tudyk, James Cromwell, Chai McBride, Jerry Wasserman, and others. Oh, Shia LaBeouf shows up. He's got a little bit part in this. It was directed by Alex Proyas, like I said. It was written by Jeff Vinter and Akiva Goldsman, even though Jeff Vinter actually didn't technically work on this script. He wrote the precursor script. He wrote something called Hardwired, which was going to be actually an Asimov kind of spin-off. It was going to be the 10th story. I believe there's 9 stories that he did with that, dealt with like the law of robotics and whatnot. And he wanted to make a 10th story, and he did a script that even the Asimov, what would you call it, like his family, his estate, really approved of. They're like, this is more Asimov than Asimov. But of course, as things go, big stars get attached, things change, directors change. So they went and heavily rewrote the script with Akiva Goldsman. The synopsis is, in 2035, a technophobic cop investigates a crime that may have been perpetrated by a robot, which leads to a larger threat to humanity. So this movie has a really long history to the theater. Really long history before it ever becomes a movie. It started out as a collection of short stories. It's not actually a book per se. Isaac Asimov, a science fiction writer, a lot of those guys wrote short stories and would publish their work in science fiction magazines and little collections and whatnot. And I think in the 1950s, maybe late 40s, I could be wrong on the dates there a little bit, but they collected all of his laws of robotics stories, is what they were called, kind of. And he put like a loose framework together, because a lot of times the stories actually had the same characters and whatnot, but often they didn't really have anything to do with each other. They were just kind of ways to explore his laws of robotics. Which, if you don't know what they are, actually, I'll just ramble them off here. Number 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Number 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the second or the first or second laws, rather. So he just wrote a bunch of stories that kind of explored those concepts and how they could go wrong, how they could be right, etc., etc. And then he put in a loose framework when it became a collection to try to kind of like stitch them together. He made it so it's like one of the doctors, I can't remember their name right now off the top of my head. It's been a long time since I've read iRobot, but it's like a series of interviews and flashbacks. That's the kind of the structure of the short story collection. Not really necessary, but I guess they just did it to, I don't know, sell some more copies, get people to buy something they'd already bought before. In the first instance of this, like the rumblings of this becoming a movie, it starts in the 70s, I believe. Harlan Ellison, science fiction author, short story writer. Harlan Ellison. If you don't know who he is, please go look him up. Really prolific, really smart, really funny dude. Very controversial in the science fiction author community. He was really kind of a contentious figure, kind of a gadfly, kind of an asshole, but in kind of the best way. He just really believed in what he believed in, and he fought for it. And he had a sense of ego about himself that was kind of earned. He kind of knew where he stood in that community, and he let everybody know about it. But anyway, so he writes a movie version. He writes a script version of it that actually takes all the stories and combines them and made something of a mystery movie. And that was actually, from all accounts, very, very coherent. It was really good. People really like it. It was actually published in the early 90s as iRobot, Harlan Ellison's illustrated script, I believe. You can actually get copies of it to this day. You go on eBay, they're like $6. I actually looked. I might order a copy myself. I'm very curious. I'm a big Harlan Ellison fan, actually. If you haven't, one of the things he's probably most known for is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is kind of a dystopian science fiction short story, and he's got a collection that comes with that. They're all good. He's just a good writer. But that never really went anywhere, and a lot of that had to do with Harlan Ellison himself being the contentious guy that he was. He didn't get along with studio heads. I believe it was at Warner Brothers back in the 70s, and nothing ever happened with it. And then you kind of flash forward to the late 90s. This guy Jeff Vinter gets permission from the Asmanoff estate to do something like special. He wants to add to the legacy of iRobot, of this collection of short stories. He wants to write another one. So he writes a script called Hardwired, which by all accounts, I've never read it, but from what I understand, is one of the best like sci-fi scripts never produced, really, kind of. Because it had a bunch of different directors. I think Bryan Singer was attached to it at one point, and somehow Alex Proyas gets attached to it. And he wants to make it a little bit more populist, a little bit more summer action movie, but he still wanted to maintain its kind of darkness. He wanted to do something a little subversive. But once Will Smith gets brought on board, who's a studio mandate, this is not, I don't believe that was Alex Proyas' choice to cast Will Smith. Will Smith basically comes in and he's just like, I save the world at the end of all my movies. And they had a script that was much darker, much more complicated, not as straightforward in terms of like who's good and who's bad. And Akiva Goldsman has to come in and kind of clean up and turn it into a summer blockbuster Will Smith movie. So that's where we get to the actual movie itself. And just in general, how do I feel about iRobot? It's interesting. It's not a great movie, but not bad either. It's like one of these kind of pleasantly mediocre movies where you feel like you just kind of shut your brain off, sit in front of the TV and veg out for a little bit. It does have some thought-provoking ideas. I think there is more Asmanoff in this script than maybe some people might give it credit for. It's just that it's imbalanced with all the kind of bad set pieces. And some of that has to do with the transitionary period of CGI and practical effects. This is a very CGI heavy movie, so much so that it's distracting. It does not create a very credible world that the story takes place in. Everything just looks too plastic and CGI-ish. But beyond all that, there are some interesting things. There is some interesting stuff. There's maybe even a mildly interesting twist in the movie. It's kind of predicated on a mystery. They want to make it feel kind of like an action police procedural movie. I don't know if it ever actually really achieves that to any great degree because of Will Smith, it feels like he's just is kind of too smart. He's too clever. He comes to conclusions out of nowhere, kind of. And it can be distracting because you're like, well, why would somebody do this? It's just like too preoccupied with making Will Smith look cool, from his costuming to his like his character behavior, to the weird product. They have this weird product placement for Chucks. Because with his character, he's a police detective, and he hates robots. He's a robot phobe, a technophobic cop, as the description said, and he loves everything that's analog. So he listens to records and he wears Chucks. He drives a motorcycle. So it's I get it, but it's a little silly in the way that it's built into the movie. There's a version of this movie that is much more low key. It is much darker and much more serious. But here they really did go for the kind of summer blockbuster route where there's quips and one-liners and Will Smith acting like Will Smith. It's weird. And they shot the movie in a way, I guess. So I was reading some background info on it. And they had Alex Proyas had a really contentious relationship with the studio. And the studio was constantly being like, yo, you got to make this funny. You got to like make this lowest common denominator. And they were constantly pushing like humor. So what they did was they shot the movie in a way where they thought they could cut out the jokes. And then they start test screening it. The ones with the jokes, because of Will Smith, play better to the audience. So what you get in the movie is actually something that's a little dissonant. There's little kind of tonal problems because there's like these overt Hollywood cliche action quips, but then other parts of Will Smith's performance and character are like incredibly dour and serious. And it just doesn't ever organically feel like one thing leads to the other when it comes to his behavior and the tone of the movie sometimes. So it just feels a little out of place. It feels like a missed opportunity. And it's one, like, a lot of people like iRobot. I don't think it's an awful movie. Like I said, I think it's pleasantly mediocre, maybe a little above mediocre. I could give it that credit. It's a little got a notch above. And I think a lot of that has to do with Alex Proyas himself. If you don't know who Alex Proyas is, he is, I don't know, the purveyor of goth in the 90s. He directed The Crow, which, basically launched Hot Topic as a thing. The style of Hot Topic is from Alex Proyas in The Crow. He also did Dark City, which is the thing that most people point to when they think about Alex Proyas. It's probably his most all-around successful movie. Which is another movie that's got, it's very stylized. It has a lot of early kind of special effects work in terms of like CGI and stuff. But it was at such a nascent stage that it never went really overboard with it. And it actually adds to the style of the movie. There's a lot of green screen and stuff in Dark City, but it kind of adds to the texture of it. It adds to the vibe. And iRobot is just distracting because of how plastic everything looks. Everything's bright and clean. And maybe there was, some of that is pointed. Some of that's trying to say that the world that this story is taking place in is kind of just bought into this utopian system. And they have all these robots that are these humanoid robots that are kind of like slaves, and they clean up everything, and they're your servants, and they hold your purses, and they cook your dinner, and they take your kids to school, and yada, yada, yada. So, I'm not saying that it doesn't have a purpose or the intent wasn't there, but it just hasn't aged very well. This is 16 years old, and it really, almost 16 years exactly, actually. 3 days away from the 16-year anniversary of iRobot. So it just hasn't aged well, and it becomes very distracting at some point. Really, it really makes you kind of check out. And I'm not somebody that necessarily would overly bother me, but for some reason, I couldn't help but see it. And I think, like, when you look at this cover, like, that kind of says it all. This is the poster for iRobot. There's another poster, which will probably be the thumbnail, that looks almost exactly the same. It's just not good. And I really don't understand. I've so many times where you'll see like alternate artwork for a movie, and it's so like gorgeous and thoughtful. And then you see what the fuck is on like a Walmart shelf. Sometimes even literally Walmart has alternate covers at their store that are not at other outlets. Even recently I noticed Joker. Joker has like so many different covers. I think Walmart has its own like Joker cover for the DVD. Because surprisingly enough, DVDs still outsell all other home media formats. So there you go. But yeah, so it's distracting, and then the mystery itself is not like good enough to not have that distraction matter to your enjoyment, because at the end of the day, it is just kind of a dumb summer action movie. But like I said, I do think it has a little bit more Asimov than maybe some people give it credit for. It does kind of get into the idea of like what the laws of robotics mean, how that can kind of go awry, or and also just like kind of what happens when you give a machine the ability to learn. Like, will it develop like a sense of care? Like, is it all programming? At some point, does the learning machine itself start developing its own pathways, right? Its own neural nets. And it deals with that stuff. I think it almost, and it is a very Asimov like thing to have like one of the twists be that like, oh, it was the creator that actually loved me so much that he gave me this opportunity. He gave me this choice. Like, I can follow the laws of robotics or not. Which I think takes away a little bit of the interesting nature of the kind of the evolution of something. If you want to hear actually a pretty decent conversation about this actual topic, Big Paul and I recently did on Zoobox Goes to the Movies. We did 2001: A Space Odyssey, and there's a big section of the podcast, it's a long podcast, like 2.5 hours, where we talk about HAL and the nature of artificial intelligence and the nature of consciousness. And this movie does deal with that in some respects. And I would say this, the guy who plays Sonny, who is kind of the robot du jour, he's really good. Yeah, I think he sells it, and they did the same thing they did with Lord of the Rings for capturing Gollum, like the same kind of technology where Alan Tudyk was actually on set playing the character, and then they go in and, do a pass without him, and, check out the making of Lord of the Rings, actually. If you can get the extended cuts, there's a prolific and intense making of documentaries that'll teach you all about how they do that kind of stuff. But yeah, he's really great, and I think he does sell kind of the pathos of the character. You immediately kind of invest in Sonny's plight to a certain degree. I think taking some of the agency away from Sonny and having it be kind of this natural part of evolution kind of undermines some of like the bigger points that the movie's trying to make. You have Sonny's like developing this ability to have dreams and whatnot because he's got all this data, all this information. And then you kind of find out that he's been programmed to do that. So it almost like takes away some of it. Granted, maybe I missed something. I don't know. But that's the way it felt to me when I was watching it. And then it just has to end on something like this big, dumb action movie ending where they're just hordes and hordes of these robots with glowing red lights in their chests, and Will Smith is shooting them. And it just doesn't feel appropriate because at the end, what you find out is like the Alexa of the building. I don't know what you'd call. I can't remember the AI's name. There's this master AI that has basically come to the conclusion that to actually service the laws of robotics, they have to kind of enslave humanity because humanity can't be trusted to allow a robot to follow these rules. So to put the world in order, they have to enslave humanity. And it's not something they deal with enough at all. It is a third act Deus Ex Machina kind of twist, which would be literally the most fucking interesting thing that you could possibly do with this, is to have like kind of this pure notion of the laws of robotics kind of turning on itself. And that's when I say, that's another example of it. It is a little more Asimov than people give it credit for. It is there. Like the idea is there. They just kind of don't do anything with it, and they just like, oh, it's the big bad. So it just stops being a philosophical question and becomes a problem to solve. Like in the immediate with a rifle, with a future rifle, and future business. It's so like the ending is really dumb. If the ending was better, it honestly could have saved a lot of the movie. However clunky and kind of stupid it can be at times. If they had just done more with that idea, that concept, or had more conflict in Sonny himself. Sonny is just a hero character, and he's there's a moment where you think, oh, Sonny's going along with the AI, and that's not true. It's not. And the way he signals to that is because he winks. He winks at Will Smith because he saw Will Smith winking at Bridget Moynihan earlier in the film. So he's like become more human because of that. That's, it's the dumbest, lowest common denominator, fucking stupid hillbilly needs to understand this movie cliche shit. And it ain't good. I don't like it. I don't like it because it's so thoughtful for parts of it, and then it just constantly gets in its own way. Like I said, Will Smith is horribly miscast in this movie. But maybe, Will Smith is the only way a movie like this gets made, because it obviously had a big budget. You got to attach somebody that's going to put butts in seats. And at the time, 2004, Will Smith was that guy. Although I suppose these were kind of the waning years, or the beginning of the waning years. Because doesn't he do what does he do after? He does Hancock a couple years later. I Am Legend a couple years after this, which is another like seminal horror science fiction short story. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. And that Will Smith was in. I think he likes these things. I think he likes kind of like sci-fi, action sci-fi stuff. But his presence and like what he requires as a star sometimes just derails that shit. Like I Am Legend gets derailed because what feels like Will Smith needing to be a hero in a more straightforward sense. And it's kind of a bummer. But I will say, I haven't watched I Am Legend in a long time. Was it Francis Lawrence, the director? Guy who directed Constantine, which I think is a mildly underrated movie. He did Constantine. He did some of the Hunger Games movies. He actually recently did a movie that was not bad that came out a year or two ago, maybe like 2 years ago, called Red Sparrow with The girl from the Jennifer Lawrence. Is that her name? Jennifer Lawrence from the Hunger Games. Actually, a pretty good spy thriller. I would check it out if I were you. Kind of trashy. A little trashy, but in a good way. But yeah, I don't know. So it's just, you can just tell that there was some studio interference in the hand of like a committee leading some of this movie. You know? Apparently, even up to the day before it premiered, the producers were like threatening to change the ending of the movie. Like a couple days before it premiered, I guess they had some sort of other ending that was more like even more jokes, even more populist, even more humorous. You know, it's weird. Like producers and other people, other filmmakers, sometimes they just don't understand the material they have and what is appropriate for the actual material. I would say like Michael Bay did this a lot when he did those Transformers movies. Like he would have these kind of darker stories in those movies. They're not like traditional, like, I don't know, family film stories. They can be pretty dark sometimes. One of them ends in a literal execution. Is it Dark of the Moon, whatever the hell it's called? Literally ends with Optimus Prime, the hero, execution style killing, was it Sentinel Prime? As he's begging for his life, and then the movie ends like maybe a minute later. That's some dark shit. But it's when you put the humor in these kind of movies where it's like incongruent with the actual story, it actually comes off kind of like mean-spirited and just feels wrong. And I would say this definitely falls into that. If you were thinking about the actual ideas it's discussing, you're like, why are we having like quips? Like what are we doing? What the fuck are we doing here, guys? But I don't know. I mean, I don't hate iRobot. I don't. I think it's passively entertaining. Like I said, if you want to veg out and you want to watch something that has ideas in there, maybe it'll get you thinking. I remember when I saw it, I immediately went and read the book when I was a teenager. I was like, how old was I? Like 18 when this came out? Yeah, I was about to be 18. So I was 17 when this came out. And I definitely got me into Isaac Asimov in some respect. I think I probably had read some of his short stories at that point, but definitely had never really gotten into him. And then I ended up reading iRobot. I read the Foundation at one point, which is a series I never finished. I need to go back and finish. It's on my list. I think I even have it on my Kindle somewhere. I have all the books just waiting to be devoured. But yeah, you could do worse. You know, Alex Proyas, interesting director, man. He tries things, and people don't always understand it in his later years. He's made a couple movies that I've liked that other people haven't liked. He did Knowing with Nicolas Cage. I think that was his next movie. Was it the next movie he did after iRobot? Let's find out, everybody. Yeah, I think so. 2009. Oh, yeah, he did iRobot, Knowing, and then a movie that I need to watch again, but I could mount a small defense for, is Gods of Egypt. A wildly misunderstood movie, in my opinion. And because I think people just couldn't get into its vibe. It's like a silly adventure movie with Egyptian gods. And it just is that. It just does it. And it makes no bones about it. It doesn't wink at you. It doesn't do anything. But anyways, maybe someday I'll talk about Gods of Egypt and mount my mild defense of it, you know? Because I know it's not for everybody, but it's a fun, like, cartoonish adventure film, for lack of a better way to put it. But yeah, all right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to know more about ZooBox, you want to catch up with everything that goes on in the world of ZooBox, there are a bunch of links in the description for Facebook, for Instagram, for my personal Twitter. Also, if you'd like to make a recommendation for maybe one of these daily videos, or if you want to make a recommendation for the big show, for ZooBox Goes to the Movies, where we do complete deep dives. That one will literally we'll watch the movie 2 or 3 times, find out a bunch of research about it, and have a thorough discussion with another person. And they've been a lot of fun over the past couple months, so put it in the comments and I'll throw it on the list. All right, everybody, you have a good one.